Good morning. I am Cecilia Rouse. I'm the president of Brookings, and I have the honor of welcoming you today for what promises to be a very stimulating and extremely important event. As nations around the world grapple with enormous, diverse, and interlocking challenges, the multilateral system is clearly struggling to rise to the occasion. The need to reform the global financial architecture to better cope with the collective challenges of the modern world is clear. However, it is less clear which specific reforms should be carried out. Last Monday, the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings unveiled a new report to move towards answering this uncertainty. The report distills findings and recommendations from 40 experts representing over 25 institutions from across the global north and the global south. The reform of our global financial architecture will undoubtedly prove difficult, but these findings provide a motivating place to start. I'm also encouraged by the momentum that we are observing, including the full weight of the United Nations as we approach the Summit of the Future scheduled for this September. We are deeply honored to have Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, here with us to share some remarks and reflections on the UN's reform agenda. Ms. Mohammed has a long and highly esteemed career in public service. She served as special advisor to former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, leading the process that resulted in the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals. As Minister of Environment of Nigeria, she steered the country's efforts on climate action. She also rose to the position of advisor to 4 successive Nigerian presidents on poverty, public sector reform, and sustainable development. Finally, Ms. Mohammed has served on numerous international advisory boards, holds several honorary doctorates, and is a recipient of various global awards. Ms. Mohammed, thank you for your dedicated service. Following the Deputy Secretary's opening remarks, we have a distinguished lineup of panelists who will guide a discussion around the Brookings' new report. Madam Secretary, the podium is yours.
Goodness. Oops. Let's see if this moves a bit. Thank you so much. Oh, wow. Right. Okay. So, Madam President and many, many friends in the room that I can see, and it's really a pleasure to be with you. This week is really tough because it's second to the United Nations General Assembly speed dating, so we're in and out everywhere, and our brain space is occupied by so many of the really tough things that we're doing today. But thank you to the Brookings Institution. As always, they keep this space open for us to have really important discussions here. It's one of the places where I think the community in DC has come to know with the SDGs and the work that we've done, both with Homi Karas and John MacArthur. But a really big thanks to my brother, Brahima Coulibaly, because it's been a long time that we have been looking for this space, and this report that you have done is important to us right at this time, and to really use that as a connector to the things that we need to do that we are obviously falling behind on. The world that we are in today, we know it's facing existential risks. Is this the first time? No. But I think this time it's on steroids because we're so connected. We're having to react in every one of our spaces to what someone will say on your phone. And this is government having to react without any thinking and no consultation. And it's very hard. I can tell you that in the UN, positions on issues that come overnight or within that first 30 minutes of the day are really hard to do. But from conflicts to climate change, poverty to growing inequalities, these issues know absolutely no borders, and we're seeing that daily. They are global and can only be addressed globally. And when everyone says push back on multilateralism, for us, the UN is our global town hall for the global village, and that's where solutions can be had for issues that are beyond any one constituency, country, or another. And today, we're not as equipped to do so as we have been in the past. Our geopolitical divides and much of our outdated multilateral institutions are hindering today the collective action that we need. In 2021, the Secretary General's report on our common agenda called for renewed solidarity between people, country, generations, and a multilateralism fit for the 21st century. Since then, our challenges have only grown greater, And we are running out of time to make that pivot, to change to what could be more responsive for future generations. Our September Summit of the Future, it is a generational opportunity to change course and to reshape the global governance anchored in equity, in solidarity, justice and transparency. This includes delivering a clear way forward to the reforming of the global financial system. The current financial system and its architecture was created nearly 80 years ago, and over 3/4 of today's countries were not present at the creation of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. In many cases, my country, we were still under colonial rule. This architecture was designed at a time when there was a tragedy, and we didn't want to go back from that in the war, the Marshall Plan. And it did work. It worked for those that it mattered for at that time. And we can see the results of that today. But we're seeing that addressing the scale and complexity of today's challenges, from deeply integrated financial markets to increasing systemic risks and a growing climate emergency, is even harder. It can't deliver the stable, affordable and long-term financing that is necessary to rescue the SDGs. There was a very robust financing for development frame around the Addis Ababa Agreement. It has not been able to implement today the SDGs. It cannot protect countries from the ever-increasing shocks that we've seen. Last year, the SDG Summit issued a strong political declaration acknowledging the urgency of reforming the international financial architecture. So we believe that the time has come to transform political declarations into the actions that are needed, but even more difficult today. The Secretary General has put forward a bold set of reforms across 6 areas. First, reforms to the global economic governance that give a voice to developing countries. Second, a development-oriented debt architecture that is more just, more agile, and more effective, giving countries the confidence to borrow in a volatile world. And third, a massive scaling up of long-term affordable financing, primarily through tried and tested multilateral development banks. Fourth, a real global financial safety net that allows developing countries to respond to crises just as vigorously as many economies have in recent years, from COVID to the war in Ukraine, and most recently, those tensions that we see in the Middle East. Fifth, the financial sector regulatory reform to create long-term incentives for all public and private sectors, fostering sustainability and stability. And sixth, an international tax architecture that is fair and inclusive for all countries. These proposals are now being actively debated. They're being interrogated, and we can see from where we're coming from, where we're going, the gap to try to get to them. Many of the issues I've raised in these 6 are being discussed at the spring meetings. The Brookings publication launched today provides a valuable contribution to these reflections, and we welcome your engagement to build a strong intellectual and moral case for the reforms. I'd say beyond that, the transformations that need to happen. We are seeing some progress. Reform efforts are underway on multilateral development banks and on international tax under the direction of the international financial institutions, the G20, and the United Nations. But still, some lack ambition and I would say a sense of urgency. Piecemeal and partial reform attempts are fueling impatience, frustrations, and this is building a huge chasm of distrust in the very ability of the multilateral system to find collective solutions. Our challenge, immediate, between now and September, is to muster the political will to change this. At the Summit of the Future, what we're calling on member states to commit to is putting forward a package of reforms to the international financial architecture that meets the urgency of the moment and really does deliver on the needs and rights of people today. And that's for all 8 billion. So we very much look forward to having this discussion, hearing from you some of the concerns, but also the opportunities that we can use to push the agenda forward. Much of what is needed to fix our world is known. There's no shortage of the work that's been done to show that. We are looking for the political will, but perhaps the narrative and the leverage that we have in the conversations, something we're doing that's not quite right. We know that we can turn around on a sixpence to address a response and a recovery from COVID, from the tragedies in Ukraine, and yet we can only do it for half the world. The other half in our global community needs to be brought along. What is it that we can do to bring our institutions to those solutions that inform the political will that is needed to act on getting the 2030 agenda done sooner rather than later? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Secretary, for spending part of your morning with us. When I first thought about extending an invitation, I didn't know whether you would accept, given that Nigeria lost to Cote d'Ivoire on the final of the World Cup. But I'm glad to notice that you're not holding any grudges.
We're living to fight another day.
Yes, the invitation nonetheless. And I wanted to use this opportunity to thank really all the 39 independent experts from the 25 organizations that have participated in the roundtable discussions that have led to this report. And I see some of them here in this room today. I think through that kind of collaborative spirit, we're all better off. And then we can put forward something that really reflects the diversity of the concerns out there. So thank you again all for your participation in this event. Madam Deputy Secretary, I now have the honor to present you with your own special copy of the report.
Have you signed it?
I can sign it.
And all the other agencies. You see?
There you go.
It's great to see men taking instruction from women.
Your own autograph copy. So if I can start, I think last year it was really clear that midway through SDGs, we were really not on track. And we still have about 5 to 6 more years to go. Can you comment a little bit on the importance of this reform agenda on the international financial architecture for our ability to really make significant progress in the remaining time that we have?
Mm-hmm. I think the recognition that what we have is, it's not so much it has failed, it's just that 75 years later, shelf life on anything is expiring, right? Mm-hmm. And we need to have a different response. If you woke up today and you saw the kind of challenges that we have with a population of 8 billion, what would you design? Mm-hmm. It probably is not the same financial system that we have today. And I think that's what we're taking to task, is that it has to be far more inclusive and responsive to what we need and to move those resources more equitably. We've gone past limiting our development, I think, in the world to just ODA. Mm-hmm. That happened when the SDGs came along and we said, look, we're going to do all of it. Many people thought 17 goals were, first of all, the odd number. But as John's grandmother said, well, so's the world. You know, there's a lot of odd responses that we have to respond to. But for real, there is no reason why we cannot respond to development in the conceptual paradigm shift that we had for sustainable development. There was a big discussion in financing for development that we had to shift from billions to trillions. And to do that, the financial architecture does not allow you access to those resources. And there are many things that we have seen in the reports that have come out more recently on what's needed annually. So it is trillions. It's, you know, we cannot keep tinkering around with the billions. It's it figures anywhere between 3 and 5 trillion. It's a climate agenda. It's a sustainable development agenda. Do we have access to markets for countries that perhaps would be rated as difficult to lend that money to? Do we have multilateral development banks that are governed in such a way that will give the right responses to countries that are looking for that? Are we limited to just vulnerable and low-income countries? What happens to our middle-income countries where vast populations and inequality exists? You're graduating from a low-income country to a middle-income country. It's like penury today. If you see how the access to resources then becomes far more difficult. And I think that's what we're saying with the international financial architecture. It's beyond just the governance. It's what does it actually do to open up resources for everybody in a more equitable way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think you alluded to this a bit earlier, the issue of trust. We must overcome that if we're going to make progress on this reform agenda. From where you sit, how are you seeing the process unfolding? Are we on a good track to have a successful summit? Are there some challenges? What are some of the key challenges and pain points?
Well, I think we're far from saying we're going to have a successful summit. people are dealing with the here and now, and it seems very unequal. The treatment one conflict gets from another, the treatment one country gets to another in terms of access to resources that are for development. The lack of commitment on a climate agenda that demands of developing countries to meet transitions for which there are no resources, and they have least to do with the emissions. So it feels like a world that has got two levels of responses, and I think that's what's building the frustrations and the trust. Now, in the UN, if you're on a political agenda, you will say you need confidence-building measures that you can find peace in conflict. I would say that we need to find the trust-building measures, and those measures have to come from a slew of solutions that have been put up. We need to do something about the debt framework. The common debt framework doesn't work. It had good intentions, and we leaned forward and we tried, but we need to take lessons, and we need to be frank that if it was going to take 3 years for countries in the developed part of the world to resolve a problem, it wouldn't be acceptable. You'd probably have an election, a snap election, and you'd be out. This is not, because there's no sense of urgency to what this costs countries like Zambia. So we have to do something about that, and I think we can. It's been done in the past, and we can find solutions to this. The second is the fiscal space, and there are many things that we can do more immediately with the MDBs, and you will hear all the issues that have come for discussion this week, from callable capital to really making use of leveraging the private sector. Perhaps the general capital increase will come next year. We hope we'll get that into the summit of the future. But there is, a historic moment for the IMF where they were able to produce 650 billion SDRs. That was remarkable. Yeah. Of course, some of us, and Vera's in the room, wanted $1 trillion, right? Yeah. But we got the 650, and that's good enough. Yeah. We saw the IMF come up with a mechanism for middle-income countries on the Resilience Trust Fund. But has it worked? Again, lots of people leaning in. Concerns about, you have to have a program, and so what does that do to you in the market? Is it either or? Can you do both? And so perhaps there could be more traction to that fund. But I think what is more alarming is probably in parallel what the bank is trying to do with its better bank, right? Before it gets bigger, which is that how much has gone out the door on the RST. And I think we're generous when we say maybe 5%. And if you look at the results, then you'll know that, okay, this is not working. We need to do something with that. So when we make a call for SDRs, of which there are still many, we know that Europe and some others cannot give more of the SDRs they have, but we know there's 6 or 7 countries that can. And if they can give it to tried and tested vehicles like the MDBs, why not? Because the MDBs will leverage between 5 and 7, whereas where they are in the RST, 1-to-1, doesn't do what it needs, and we need fiscal space now. We cannot have countries with a debt service they never bargained for because of those shocks, paying more for debt service than they are education and health. So create that space. It's doable. And then, of course, we have to look at the climate agenda. We have some great leadership in the G20 right now. They will be the same leadership in COP30, where there will be demands of the community from the Paris Agreement to have economy-wide NDCs, and anyone that sat at the helm of the economy will know that even for the G20, is an ask and a half. And then you're asking 130 other countries to do this with not much on the table. Right. So I think we're in a very, I think lots of opportunity, but where are we going to get the change from? Where are we going to get the action around the political muscle that's needed for this to happen? We're seeing some signals, so we keep amplifying. Prime Minister Motley said yesterday she feels like a broken record. We need stuff like this to make sure that not only is she feeling that, but we should amplify those voices that feel very alone. And I think that the work that you do here, the work that is done in this community, could help to perhaps shake up the institutions. When we say better, we're not just talking about more efficiency. We're talking about rolling up your sleeves of the capacities that you have to deal with the solutions that are needed now, and to be less risk-averse and think you've got another 20 years to do something about it.
Yeah. I think it's really great you mentioned the 650 billion SDRs, but I think it was the broad consensus among the participants at our roundtable that that the whole system needs to change, because we now have a struggle of trying to rechannel those SDRs through MDBs, and that takes another layer. It relies on some countries' willingness to give those SDRs. So trying to move toward a system where the creation itself is not only systematic, but then the IMF has the flexibility to channel them automatically where it's most needed. And I think your point about the common framework and how long it takes, it's not just when it takes long, the socioeconomic impact is already being felt all throughout this time, right, while trying to work out the debt. So it's certainly important to speed that up. And then you mentioned the findings on development and at the Addis meeting. I think important part of that was also to boost domestic resource mobilization, right, for those countries to have access to the long-term sustainable financing that you touched on in your remarks. And I think taxation is at the core of that, right? And taxation of the multinational corporations, I think, is also important and key to this. The emerging market, developing countries' abilities to mobilize their own set of finances. There was a UN resolution that now shifted control of global tax cooperation from OECD to the UN. And there's a UN tax convention coming up next year. So what do we hope will be different and that could be achieved during that tax convention, given the centrality of tax revenue mobilization for domestic development objectives?
Well, I mean, clearly it's important that we have that discourse and continue to build on the efforts that have happened around tax, and domestic resource mobilization is at the core of that. And I think there's been a lot of capacity and support for countries to do it. But if you don't have the investments, you're not going to do as well as we would like to. Going beyond the borders, it's not ceding control of tax to the UN. Okay. It's about broadening the base for who sits at the table to take decisions about tax globally, at a national level and across borders. And I think that that's where the tension is, to have it in a space where is not inclusive and doesn't respond to today's needs and realities is what was debated. And I think member states decided to bring that into a wider domain, building on the work of the OECD. We have to acknowledge there's some great work that has gone on there, and to end up with a tax convention that is far more responsive to the needs of the day, and will deal with much of what is not working in that system, and allow us more resources to work with in our countries. It's going to be tough. We see this discussion has come up in the G20. The G20 is talking about a wealth tax, and I think, that's good to put on the table. We've put many things on the table, and we just have to keep pushing. Somebody asked yesterday, are there any more, what task force would you have again for the G20? My response to that is, let's finish with the ones that we've got work to do on, and we haven't made the inroads that we could have. But on tax, I think this is a very serious issue, and I do believe that we're getting closer to having more engagement, that everyone shapes the convention. You need not to back off or to... It's going to happen. The train has left the station, so we're going to get a convention. How robust and responsive and inclusive it is will depend on all the players that come to the table and offer the best that they can.
Okay, well, wonderful. So one more last question, and then I'll turn to the audience. I woke up this morning, heard that Israel has fired back at Iran, and the financial architecture is only one of many things you have to deal with. If you can share with us what gives you hope as we see a lot of challenges around the world, and what's your secret sauce for keeping going in the face of all these challenges?
Well, we're in very small rooms where we feel quite depressed about the reality. What gives me hope is that the 4 years it took us to frame the SDGs, it was a world effort, and what we found out there in different constituencies is that they're ready to live up to the ambitions and the hopes of that agenda. And I think it's still very real that they're ready to do that. Whether we've got the leadership that it will take to make that happen, I think we're all questioning. And in the corridors and outside, I'm going to Nigeria tomorrow and opening a counterterrorism conference, an international counterterrorism conference, of course, because Sahel, you know, we're in meltdown when it comes to terrorism. But what I did hear as I was in Chile 2 days ago is that part of what we want to achieve in the Summit of the Future on the new agenda for peace, did we think about the organized crime, for which no one sits to talk about. And the fact that now leaders are able to say, look, this is becoming a very big issue. It's not Latin America's issue alone. I know in West Africa that if already we're seeing organized crime hitting the Gulf of Guinea, if the Gulf of Guinea and organized crime meets up with the terrorism of the Sahel, game over. So we can't afford that. And to have that huge swath in a region between Latin America, the US, and Europe, I mean, this is of course, a realistic nightmare. But the hope that I have is that there are many people working on this, and they're working on solutions that will bring about a solution to this. And we're constantly convening. This meeting here today, I am pretty sure that I'm going to take away from the questions that you give to me a solution in another space to make that argument. One of the big arguments that was brought to the table, and I guess this again coming from the Rockefeller, but it's been made by many, is the net outflows from developing countries to developed countries. This is a headline of injustice. Now take that into another room and people begin to think again about how they're addressing it. So I first don't have the luxury of being pessimistic. There's many billions out there who look to the UN and its commodity of hope, so we have to keep that candlelight. But I do see enormous potentials of leadership. I see many more young people who are saying, we're not going to accept this. This is our future. Yes, we're anxious. We don't know which way it's going, but they're engaging. We need to open up that space for them. We need to open up that space for women, and I'm also, you know, very impressed by the number of women that we see that are taking leadership now as well.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. So now, a few questions from the audience. So please raise your hand, state your name, and keep your comment or question very brief. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Bianca Getzel. I'm a researcher at ODI in London. And I was very struck by your initial remarks where within them you talked about the need for financial sector reform, which is extremely important, especially if we relate that to getting anywhere close to billions to trillions, which, as you've acknowledged, we're nowhere near achieving. So my question is, when we think of that need for financial sector reform, how do we do that when really we don't have the political grip over the financial sector the way we have over a lot of other things we've discussed, fiscal space, MDBs, et cetera? The G20 has some of that space, but how do you see the role of the international development community to actually give incentive and messages from the top when we're dealing with very heavy and difficult financial sector regulation from Solvency II to Basel, et cetera? Thank you.
And then the lady behind will take 3 questions.
Thank you. I'm Ge Fei Zhou. I'm a grad student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So my question is, given that the reform of the global financial architecture takes time, how do you think in the short term the global south can better leverage the financial architecture and play the rules set by the developed world to its advantage to increase the financing?
And then the last question.
Peter Doyle, very much ex-IMO senior staff. When you say that the common framework is not working, I completely agree. But most people, when they say that, think that what needs to happen is more speed. I actually think the core problem is that the core parameters that are set in debt restructuring by the IMF do not follow best practice. If you look at, say, the 46 programs which are presently in place, 32 of them have medium-term fiscal, primary fiscal targets that do not follow best practice. South Sudan, 8 percentage points of GDP adrift. Mozambique, 7 percentage points of GDP adrift. Malawi, 6, and others. We have the minister from Kenya here. The Kenyan number is 2 percentage points of GDP adrift. 2% may not sound much, but I'm sure the minister will agree that his problems with housing, with this cost of living, with the wage bill, will be much improved by a permanent 2 percentage point fiscal space. I suggest that instead of just focusing on the speed problem in common framework, you focus on the core parameters being misspecified.
You can take them in any order you like.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the last question first. And sometimes, you know, we all have partnerships and collaborations that we have to keep constructive. I'm in complete agreement with you. We're not talking about speed, we're talking about a rehash. It doesn't work, and when it doesn't work, it's not an incremental fix on the common debt framework. But this is huge. This is huge disagreements as to, you know, how you come at that. And I think this is where the IMF, when you ask the IMF to come up with a solution and they buy into looking at that solution, they're one of the best at doing it. So they've got the capacity and the expertise to do it. What we're asking now is that, are they ready to really open up, more transparent about the methodologies, bring everyone to the table and find those solutions to a debt framework? Is not rocket science. I think countries who are either facing that dilemma right now or in crisis are best placed to be at that table to have that discussion, to look at those parameters. That's not happening right now. And that's half of what we're saying is needs to change, is that who's at the table, who's actually sitting in the institutions to determine how we're going about this. And that's not where it should be right now. So we hope, I have to tell you that a few months ago, everything was wonderful with the debt framework. In the G20, there's an acknowledgement that it needs to be looked at again. That in itself, okay, when we're going to look at it again, are we going to tweak it? If we're going to tweak it, it's not going to work again. And we don't have the time for that. And we're going to see a lot more debt distress happen. To the other two questions, the international financial architecture, in the end, is a power issue. It's a negotiation of what the powers that be are ready to see as not a loss, but as a gain in opening up that space to be more responsive in the structures that they have. There's no amount of technicalities and papers that you will write. It will be about the political leadership. Now, what I have seen in years gone by since we've tried to get the SDGs off the ground is that institutions matter, and the people in those institutions inform those leaders. Those leaders are often not in that place for very long. And so whether it's leaders at the board or it is leaders in capital, this has to happen, a better connection between what is put on the table, not from the outside in, because that doesn't work, it's from the inside as it works through. So can we in this community engage with the institutions themselves and try to shift that? I heard some interesting things yesterday from one of the managing director of the IMF, and I was, wow, okay, that's a big change from 6 months ago. Now I need to take him up on that and say, okay, so when we're having the discussion at the DC or we're having the discussion at another table, will you follow through with the things that you said here that you're hearing? But the political leadership at Capitol, it needs to be informing that leadership needs to happen in a much bigger way. We're seeing this in the negotiations of the Summit of the Future, the IFA. There's considerable pushback from many capitals on how ambitious and how soon that becomes a reality. But there's also a calling from the majority of the world to say it's got to happen. So happen it will. A few years ago, if you had put in the international financial architecture, as the Secretary General had done, no one wanted to hear it. And you were sort of, this is not your space, you're conflating mandates, don't talk about it. Today we're all talking about it. It's how it will happen. We've always put on the table what is a longer-term objective of negotiating that change in the financial architecture, international financial architecture, but there's the SDG stimulus that shows you that what you can do with what we have. And some of that I've talked about in the remarks I had earlier. And it is what we're speaking about to MDB reform, access to markets. I haven't spoken about credit rating agencies, but they also have to come to the table. We need them, but we don't need them in the shape and form that they are today for many countries who have to do an either or. That also, a few years ago, you could not even a year ago, you couldn't put that on the table. Now we are. The MDB reforms, callable capital, for which we think is important, but as is the SDRs, as are a number of the issues that we put there, including tax. So it's there in the ask. It's a question of whether we can get that through boards, we can get that with member states who have it. There's a meeting of the G7 today. We've put it on their agenda. There will be a meeting of the G20. We will continue. There's a working group of the G20 that happened this week. So keep pushing, keep amplifying, but give clarity to the asks. Asks are never too ambitious if the homework is done, and that ambition is a response to the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that we've done too little and often too late. So it is important that we get the scale. It is important that we think of this in terms of urgency. It's not a humanitarian crisis that we're dealing with. It's a development crisis. And that will only get worse. It's not good enough for us to say, oh, there's a backslide on gender rights. Well, there's a backslide because we're not investing in them. It's not just a question of governments who want to roll it back. Some governments have choiceless choices to make between debt servicing, education, women's rights, and health.
Wonderful, excellent. So with that, I think that's all the time we have. I want to fully thank you again, Madam Deputy Secretary General. I think this reform agenda would always be difficult in normal times, and let alone now in a time of really heightened geopolitical tensions. And we really wish the UN and yourself a successful summit. And thanks again for your dedicated service and for your leadership.
Thank you.
So if I may ask everyone to remain a bit seated as to allow her to make her way to the next meeting. I've held her already 10 minutes longer than
That's okay,
was
no.
budgeted to.
But thank you very much, everyone, because the questions that you've asked have also put on the agenda. I've got my teams here. But we need your support. We need you to use this network and to leverage the reports that have been made. Batashiraya is here, the Summers report, Vera Songwe. These are important pieces of work that you've all done. This report is something that I know that my member states will look at and will help. I don't want to say to give them the ammunition, but to give them the wherewithal to fight at those tables for the space that we need. So thank you so much.
All right, wonderful.
Thank you.
And we can have a couple of minutes break to stretch legs, and then we'll transition right into the next panel.
Thank you all. So if we could get seated, we'll start with the panel part of this event. We had a very stimulating set of remarks by the Deputy Secretary General. I can assure you that we'll have a very stimulating set of comments from these panelists. I know them, and they have much to contribute. So I'll introduce them as I asked, each of them a first round of questions, then a second round of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I'll begin with Minister Azucena Arbeleche on my left. She is the Minister of Economy and Finance of Uruguay, and if I could say, the first woman to hold that position. So that's a real symbol of change. But she's also had a really illustrious career as a professor, as an economist, and as a civil servant, and specialty has been very much around debt and debt issues. So with that, let me turn to you with my first question. Uruguay has been really a pioneer on climate action, and I personally have tracked you and your work. It's a country with 100% renewable energy. So when we talk about energy transitions and all that, that's the benchmark. So you are really at the top of the class. And the Ministry of Finance, I've worked with a coalition of finance ministers on climate action, and we look to Uruguay as a real leader. The one area that Uruguay has been a real leader on has been in sustainability-linked bonds. The feature that you have put in, which is the step down if you meet your NDC, is a great innovative feature. And from your background and relating it to the conversation we are having here, what role have the international financial institutions played in this journey? But also, how do you think their role could be strengthened in supporting emerging markets and developing countries on climate action?
Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for that question. Let me begin by saying that the Uruguay advocated at a very, very early stage in the Development Committee of the World Bank and IMF. So there we do have a first important presence of the multilateral institutions. From that stage, as chair of the Development Committee, Uruguay advocated for this idea that we had to consider environment as a global public good. Climate action, diversity, nature conservation, food security, those aspects had to be considered. And in that sense, it was important to distinguish among different countries according to this environmental behavior that they had. If countries contributed to this global public good, then they should be rewarded. If they didn't, then they should be punished. But that idea we just have been leaving behind as we further developed on this topic. We do think as ministries of economy and finance that we have a very powerful instrument that are the financial instrument. Incorporating financial incentives into the different products can make the difference. We work with carrots. Carrots make us move forward. So in that sense, Uruguay has been working on very financial innovative instruments where we provide incentives to stimulate climate action. So what we have been concrete, we have been delivering instruments that embed this economic incentive to move forward. Specifically, we have in October 2022, we issued a sustainability-linked bond in that case, the interest rate, the coupon, was linked to key performance indicators that come from the NDCs 1, from the Paris Agreement. And there, at that time, we worked with a two-way structure so that we had a step up or a step down if we met or not, or if we didn't meet our key performance indicators. I think that this kind of measures and what came later really contributes to this discussion that we are having about designing a new financial architecture. So these are the kind of mechanism that we would like to see. Moving forward, we stuck more to this idea of positive incentives, of rewarding the countries that have a good behavior. So in that sense, we worked with the World Bank and with other multilateral institutions, but that are playing a key role. I really think that multilateral institutions are at a unique place to make this thing happen and to give really momentum and move forward with this idea. In October of last year in Marrakesh, in the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF in Marrakesh, the World Bank announced that it was authorizing Uruguay to move forward with a loan where the interest rate was linked to a key performance indicator. In this case was the reduction of methane, which for Uruguay, a country that raises cattle where we have comparative advantages, it's very important because we have to continue doing this on a sustainable way. So this was the new issue was that it wasn't a step down or a step up, it was only a reward, a step down that Uruguay could have if we met certain this indicator. And this, of course, the idea is that this can be replicable to other countries. So I say that multilateral institutions are at a unique place to foster and to make progress in that regard. And a final point I would say is in this work, the transparency of what we are doing, what the issuers are doing, what the multilateral institutions are doing, and also what the developed countries are doing. It's very important. Transparency and accountability. Because in the case of the instrument that Uruguay is working, the bond it has issued, or the loan that it is working to disperse, accountability, it's very important. Accountability for the multilateral institutions is very important, and for developed countries. We need accountability for the pledges that have been raised by developed countries, but today we still don't see those results. And I leave it there, but maybe in the second question I come back to some of these points.
I think the point that you make, which is if we want global collective action, there has to be a system of transparency and accountability, for which we also, of course, need data and metrics. And we're glad to come back to maybe that in the second round. So let me turn to Jose Antonio Campo. He's professor and director, School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He has served as minister in his own country. You have done so many portfolios, Jose Antonio, that I have to remember, but it's a good test for me. So he's been Minister of Finance and Public Credit in two different incarnations, also Minister of Agriculture. He was the Executive Secretary of what we call CEPAL or ECLAC, and our colleagues are here who've been associated with that. And very, very crucially, and at a very important point in time, he was the UN Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. Professor Campo, you have thought more deeply and for longer on many of these issues than anybody I'm familiar with, and you worked very, very closely with our dear friend Kemal Dervish and on many of these issues. You co-taught a course on this in Columbia, and I remember those days very well. You can speak on this, I know, for 2 hours, but you have 5 minutes. So the question to you is, when you look at the landscape today, and many of the issues that you had highlighted 2 decades ago still bedevil us in many ways. And if you had to reflect, where do you think that progress has been made, and what would be the biggest priorities from your view that we need to push on?
Well, thank you, Amar, and let me start by thanking the Brookings Institution for this report. It was a very participatory process. I think I participated in all the meetings that were done online, let's say, for the process, and of course, thanks for mentioning our great colleague, great economist, but particularly great friend, Kemal Dervish, who had actually ended his life when he was working here at Brookings Institution. Very good. As I told you, as you said, I taught the course with him for 5 or 6 years on global economic governance, actually, the topic that you are asking me about. But let me say that on your question, let me point out very rapidly 4 issues. The first one is the issue of voice and participation of developing countries in institution making. The report is a bit cautious on that, but I think that has to go forward, in the reforms. At least following up on the changes that were done around 2010 of both the World Bank and the IMF. But also 2 things. I agree that the double majority, which the report proposes, would be a good idea. And I will add one that is, for me, very important. I'll come back to that, which is increasing basic votes in both institutions, particularly for the poor and small countries. It's a very important topic. The second is this issue of the global coordination body. The proposal that was in the UN report, I don't like it. It makes a huge, mixing ECOSOC with the G20 is too much, let's say, in terms of size. I think it has but one good thing that would be as the report says, well, to increase the diversity of the G20, as it was done last year by including the African Union, but also more representative in some way. Actually, after the Stiglitz Commission that was called by the UN in 2009, which I participated, I wrote a paper with Joe Stiglitz, actually proposing that somehow what has to be done is to try to connect very formally the G20 with the United Nations, in a sense. That's and making elected at least some of its members, so as to be able to have a more representative institution. The third is an issue that is I have always underscored, and is in the report in several parts, which is the role of regional institutions. So aside from the global institutions, a strong network of regional institutions is essential. That only works today for multilateral development banks. But we don't have in the international monetary system, for example, very few regional institutions, and the International Tax Corporation, which is a couple of institutions. So I think that has to be a network that is very important for developing countries, actually, because they feel that the voice that they have in the regional institutions is actually stronger. And there are many, many ways in which they can cooperate with global institutions, and sometimes compete with them, which is also good. To have a bit of cooperation and competition. And finally, 2 issues that, the issues of debt and tax are of course, in some of the chapters of this report. And let me say that I think one important topic is the institution building in those 2 sectors. In the case of debt, there was this attempt in the early part of this century to do it in the IMF, to have a formal institution. I think the world, the UN has proposed, should start thinking again of an institution where debt renegotiations take place. With voluntary negotiation, then eventually arbitration. So the IMF process went. That institution could be in the IMF if of course the dispute settlement mechanism decisions have no relation with the board or the governors or the IMF, but it could be also in the United Nations. I would prefer the United Nations, but the IMF could be the house of that network. And the other is the issue of tax cooperation. Now, the OECD does have this inclusive framework, but now, of course, the UN is going through this convention process, which the report praises quite a bit. And I would say a good question mark is what institution it should have. So I go back to a proposal that I actually made when I was under Secretary General, is to transform the Tax Committee of the United Nations into an intergovernmental organ, which I think is the best way forward in that regard. It was also proposed by the G77 in Addis Abeba. In both cases, it was rejected. At least the committee has been improved and has been working very well, but I think this is also one way forward. I will conclude with that.
We have been joined on the stage by Minister Njuguna Ndungu. We'll come to you, Minister, in just a second, but thank you for rushing from your previous meeting to be here. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to now turn to Yabo Masha. She's the director of the Intergovernmental Group of 24 on International Monetary Affairs and Development. She has had an illustrious career in the IMF, working on many different countries, and she was also a member of Nigeria's Presidential Economic Advisory Council. Dr. Masha, the G24 has long stressed the importance of governance reform in the IFIs, and as Professor Ocampo was saying, the importance of enhancing voice and representation of developing countries. It's fair to say that the kind of progress we had been making is not stalled, but it is not made. We have not made as much progress as you have argued in your latest communiqué. I think again highlights the importance of action. Could you, highlight what are the main priorities from the perspective of the developing world and the G24, and what kind of time frame should we be looking for?
Thank you very much, Amma, and thank you, Brookings School, for organizing this event. Like Jose, I also participated in the virtual events, some of them, not all, and I think this is a very good synthesis of all the issues that were discussed. Now, on the issue of the reform of international financial institutions, specifically the Bretton Woods institutions, I know the issue that comes up over and over again is governance reform, but we cannot talk about governance reform without talking about the quota, because the quota does determine what governance structure you put on top of it. And on the issue of the quota, I will say that there has been no progress. The Articles of Agreement says that every 5 years there should be a quota review that realigns the shares of countries to reflect changing economic circumstances. There has been none since 2008. Since 2008, 3 of our members, China, Brazil, India, have become part of the top 10 largest economies in the world. That's members of the G24. But still, their quota has not changed. And so if the quota of the IMF, a quota-based organization, does not reflect economic realities, then we really ask ourselves, what is the legitimacy of that organization? What does it mean for the geopolitical, geoeconomic relationships? Now, on the quota issue, there has been some progress. I won't say a lot of progress. Maybe this past annual meeting, there was an agreement to increase equiproportionally the quota of all countries. In other words, there is no realignment to reflect the relative size of economies. So, well, that's progress because it does provide IMF additional financial resources, making it less reliant on borrowing from bilateral and agreement to borrow sources. But as long as the underlying problem remains, then we have other issues that come with it. One is the leadership issue, the leadership selection process. And I note that in the report, there's a recommendation to keep the leadership selection process as it is now. My own take is that it's going to be difficult. I mean, let's say we reach some agreement next year on the quota, which is what is on the table, and there's a quota realignment. Then with the realigned quota, we're going to need to change the way in which the leadership process goes, is recruited. And I think that it should be an open contest that will help the organizations, both sides, both the IMF and the World Bank, and countries should not be restricted in terms of whether or not they participate. The issue of diversity with resolution of quota issue, with it reflecting the relative strengths of countries, I think then the organizations can then begin to look like their membership in the staff of the organization, the bureaucracy itself. So we will have more diversity, more representation from underrepresented regions, especially in Asia and Africa. Now, I note some of the recommendations on the actual structure of the organization, the board, the composition of the board. One thing to bear in mind is that the executive board is just like the board of governors. They are working on behalf of the board of governors. And I will say that the board of governors is more or less, analogous to the kind of board that you have in a corporate setting. So I wouldn't want to tamper with that. I would say that maybe the other committees in the World Bank, the Development Committee in the IMF, the IMFC, those ones can become, the kind of strategic type committee or board organizations that look at more strategic issues and a little bit different from the way that the executive board does now. The organizations are political organizations, so to have an apolitical board, I don't think it will work. I think board members should represent the interests of their organizations. Capital increase should be on the table for the World Bank. The World Bank is only going to be able to deliver on its mandate on the need to support countries for development financing if it has the appropriate firepower to do that. And with that, as thorny and contentious as the issue is, I just don't see a way out of capital increase. Recently, there have been all sorts of plans and recommendations on increasing, on stretching the balance sheet optimization. And of course, the bank was able to bring in some resource from there. But it's over-leveraging, and it does need to bring in the kind of capital that is really the most risk-free capital, which is the shareholders' capital. But that's also political, because then it comes to how much should China put on the table, how much should these other countries put on the table. Now, let me just recognize quickly some of the things that I think came out in the past 1 year that are positive. The third executive director for Sub-Saharan Africa, which helps to lighten the workload in that particular constituency. That also improves the governance, improves the ability of the organization to be much more efficient when it comes to dealing with some of these issues. The U.S. has flown a kite on a 5th deputy managing director to represent the emerging markets and developing countries. It's not yet official policy, but it's something that member countries find exciting. So it's something that could also speak to additional representation and voice for emerging markets. Now, for the World Bank Evolution Program is an area in which I see a lot of positive things coming up, especially on the governance side. The emphasis now being placed on country engagement. World Bank wants to have more boots on the ground and being able to now improve on the time in which it takes to close out loans, how it engages with the countries, and really taking into consideration the country's own development priorities. So I think with these, there's a lot that can go well, but there's also a lot that needs to be done.
Thank you, Dr. Masha. So last panelist is, I always introduce him as professor because he's been my professor for a long time. But he is Minister Njuguna Ndung'u, Cabinet Secretary, National Treasury and Economic Planning of the Republic of Kenya. Prior to his current position, he served as Executive Director of the African Economic Research Consortium. And prior to that, he was Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya. And in that capacity, led the M-Pesa program, which was the pioneer of mobile banking that has transformed Africa and the world. So his contribution to the world extends well beyond governance. It's actually in the very real world of change. And with that, I want to turn to you, Doctor and Minister, with a question that is really about the central role that President Ruto has been playing on the climate finance architecture. The Africa Climate Summit last September was really a milestone. It brought, both a sense of imperative, but also a sense of responsibility. And the way in which Africa came together around that agenda is key, and it has very important implications for international economic governance going forward. What do you see are the main implications for international climate finance architecture reform? What are the key priorities that are put on the table, and from the perspective of the Nairobi Declaration, and how do you think we can really now build on that?
Thank you very much. And I'm the guy who came late because so many meetings are competing, and I'm very happy to be in Brookings. I think Brahim could make sure that when I'm around, I have to visit the Brookings. Very happy, and I'm very happy to see you all. And the guy I took over from in the AERC is also sitting here, Remas and Beth. Thank you very much. We have pushed that frontier in terms of capacity building. Let me say that this is a very topical issue. In fact, one of the areas, in fact, when we talked about climate finance and even African Climate Summit in 2023, it was the whole issue of where are we in terms of the devastating consequences of the climate changes, and especially in the Horn of Africa and the whole of Africa. But the next thing is to say, but with climate change, we can also take advantage of the opportunities it comes with. And climate finance was one of them, and one of the areas that becomes very, very important. And the debate also moved further in terms of trying to discuss or even trying to have a framework of even how carbon markets can work of course, pouring from different directions, whether it's carbon pricing, carbon taxes. But for us, it was actually, let's start with carbon markets. What are the regulations that are required? And then how do we move in terms of carbon tax or even carbon pricing? But carbon tax becomes very, very important, especially for us coming from the National Treasury. It all boils down. And in fact, right now, what we are really catering about is actually saying all those Nairobi declarations, they can be again turned into opportunities of saying, look, we can actually reform the priorities of developing countries that benefit from IDA, and we can actually talk about the priorities required for IDA replenishment when those countries redefine the priorities and turn them into opportunities and create what has been the problem, what my dear sister said here, the capacity of the MDBs to transform or even to provide that required finance. It is actually the capacity problem on one side of the MDBs, but also the capacity to implement projects on the other side of the recipients. So it becomes a major problem. The whole idea is that, in fact, when my colleagues prepared my notes, they actually talked about global financial architecture and what are the progress, what are the challenges. But I think the most important thing is that what are the opportunities that we are getting from the climate finance itself, and how do we turn climate finance into a responsive pattern of that all. But let me say the broader picture, what has been the problem? And one of the problems has been the cost of finance, whether we are going to talk about climate finance or whether we are going to talk about how do we engineer the frontier, it has been the cost of finance and also the speed of engagement in terms of providing that finance and the scale required. And that has been the biggest problem. When we talk about climate finance, for example, let me pick like examples from Kenya. 93% of Kenya's energy is renewable. So it means that you can turn the renewable energy into an opportunity. And moving from renewable energy, you can move backwards to the land, you can move forward to industrialization and smart agriculture. And everything can work out. And that means that you can take advantage of that. But the scale of resources required is massive. And of course, at the end of the day, you have also segmentation in terms of this market. And even those providing finance, they also look at the future in terms of predictability of policies. So in a sense, you have a whole range of institutional issues that are very, very critical, that are very, very important, but we have to bear with them that they have to come in. What we have observed because of this failure of the financial resources to come through is the borrowing cost becomes quite inhibitive, but more importantly, the capacity and fit for purpose institutions to deal with the issues that are related to either I can call climate change as one of the constraints we are facing on the ground, but I can call it a constraint, but it's also an opportunity. But then do we have institutions that can actually take advantage of the available resources, the available opportunities, and even how things can change. Of course, the frustration in the current world in terms of financial architecture is actually the risk profiling and even pricing risk that becomes quite problematic for us all. And the segmentation even of solutions that you find, they are all segmented depending on who you talk to. And that for us is quite important. So in a sense, where do we move from there? Where we move from there is that we need capacity to develop the market, the climate finance space. And for us to develop that, it means that we have to come up with frontier solutions. Those frontier solutions can also be coupled with the capacity of the institutions, both at the recipient end and that is providing the recipient. When we look at this capacity, in fact, I look at it in terms of how the market is segmented. We have suffered, for example, you cannot even start a new project, for example, in countries where we come from because you are suffering from a risk perception somewhere. I remember I was watching our Euroboard 24 when there was a coup in Niger, it jumped by 200 basis points. the whole issue is that if you map out where Niger is and where Kenya is, it's quite problematic, even distance-wise. But the perception of the market is so critical. You cannot, and there's no way you're going to tell the market what to do. The beginning of the year, we suffered because the market did not believe how we are going to resolve the Eurobond. And we tried to tell the market that we're going to buy back. But on one hand, the rating institutions came in and said buyback would be treated as a default, as a system of default. Of course, we made a lot of noise. On the other side, everybody said, where do you get the resources? In the end, what was coordinating the market is that the government will buy dollars from the market to effect payments of the Eurobond. So in a sense, what does it mean? Then keep dollars so that you sell to the government. Appreciation of the exchange rate. You can imagine that's the kind of risk that we are facing. This is the kind of market development we are facing. So we are all talking about market development. Whether you are moving from climate finance to even the whole architecture of finance, it becomes problematic. When I was the governor of the central bank, I always listened to the market talking about bankability of the projects. I thought that was a concept of trying to discriminate about financing a project when you just talk about bankability. And that is something that we want to look at. So in a sense, we have to go back and say, can we develop this market? The imperfect market or even segmentation becomes very, very important. And then we can actually then see what kind of opportunities can we derive from here. When I was coming here, I was actually talking about when did we start this debate about the global financial architecture? Did we actually bring in climate finance into the picture? And that's where that's where my starting point was. But now that we're talking about climate finance, I need to learn more about what we need to do and what are the options. But the most important thing is that this is going to be a game changer, especially for countries like ours. And that is something that I would like to benefit a lot from, even more suggestions as we move forward. I do believe that this is going to be very, very critical for us, as well as even the capacity of the institutions that we are dealing with to actually refocus on that. And that is why today I was talking about the climate change and the impact. And we are actually asking ourselves, are we going to get the solutions within that space? And if we're going to get the solutions in that space, what do we need to do? Thank you very much. I hope, let me stop there because coming late does also not justify me to extend the debate beyond where we should go to. But I'm very happy that I was here. I was able to listen to the comments in this area, and very, very happy that we can continue this debate in different levels.
Thank you, Minister. So we have one round of questions, but this time just 2 minutes per panelist. So I'm going to hold us to account on that. I'll begin with Minister Abeleshe. As you said, you had been chair of the Development Committee. There was quite important discussions, I remember at the time, around governance reform. But very candidly also from the perspective of developing countries, some frustrations. So if you could talk about it from that, and also coming back to the theme of accountability that you mentioned, all in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. So we all know that this year we are having the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institution's creation. So I think it's obviously time that changes have to be, it's a good time for changes to be made. And this was also mentioned at the beginning by the Deputy Secretary Amina. So, and in that sense, the work done by the Brookings Institution, the booklet that was showed earlier, this is a very good input for this discussion. I would say that there are like 4 main points that are, for me and for my team, interesting to point out. First of all, we need at this point a better representation of emerging markets and developing countries. Second, I think that we need more dialogue, more communication between developing countries and developed countries. There are many, we all have the same objective at the end of the day, but sometimes we speak to each other, but we don't really understand what the other group is needing. We see a lot of resources going everywhere, but maybe the resources from developed countries could be focused and could go directly into, for example, funding the step down of the loan that Uruguay has with the World Bank, or maybe those resources go directly to implement policies so that Uruguay or other countries can really reach the NDCs. Third, I think that in this, like in many other things, there's no one size fits all, and we really have to look, and institutions have to look at the particularities, the different situations of each country. We all face different risks. And finally, but maybe the most important for this topic, is that we really need a new framework, a new financial framework, not only in terms of governance, but in terms of financial framework, where institutions can provide new financial instruments similar to what Uruguay has been doing and that I shared in the first question. So all in all, what I mean is that the different actors involved, government, private sector, both from developing countries and institutions, we all need to walk the talk. So for that, changes have to be done. The good part, or the positive note, is that I really think that we have the opportunity to have a point of inflection both in mainstreaming environmental policy into economic policy, but also in changing these institutions. And Uruguay has the political will to move forward in that direction.
Thank you, Minister. Professor Ocampo, we heard from Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed that one of the real deficiencies is the lack of effective global safety nets, financial safety nets that add to the risk premia and the instability of capital flows. You've written extensively about this. What do you think really needs to happen in terms of international monetary reform?
Well, let me perhaps start by emphasizing the countercyclical role that the International Monetary Fund, of course, has and should continue to play, but also the multilateral development banks, because private financing is pro-cyclical for emerging and developing countries. And that's a very important point. The World Bank plays that role relatively well, not the regional development banks. So that's the point. And of course, the issue of the cost of financing during crisis is also part of the countercyclical element. So the discussion, for example, of surcharges in the case of the IMF should be in the agenda, because the cost of financing for some countries has gone up very highly. Now, the other issue I want to emphasize is the issue of which the Deputy Secretary General actually mentioned, which is the issue of the special drawing rights. First of all, several of us have written a long time about the more active use of the special drawing rights as an instrument of international cooperation, including issuing special drawing rights during crisis. That was done in 2021 and in previous crises also, but also actually about how to make better use of special drawing rights. I mean, there are these two funds now in the IMF that use special drawing rights, but as the Deputy Secretary General, I think they should be deposited on a larger scale in multilateral development banks to provide financing of the programs of the banks. And let me say, and perhaps end up with this, that for me, one of the issues that has to be discussed and reformed is the issue of the double accounting of the IMF. I mean, the fact that the SDRs is like a parallel accounting, which is the reason why they are really not used as assets in any significant sense. 90% of the SDRs are totally useless, to put it that way. So you eliminate the double accounting. My proposal has been for a long time that all the SDRs that are not used should be considered deposits of countries in the IMF. which then provides financing of IMF programs, but also, again, they could also be used then to deposit in the multilateral development bank, or to create new funds in order to finance special programs, particularly in the area of climate, which is what the IMF is doing, which could be considered a good question mark whether that fund should be in the IMF or should be in the World Bank. My view, it should be in the World Bank, not in the IMF. But anyway, that's a different question. By the way, at least it was a good idea to use the SDRs more actively.
Thank you, Professor Ocampo. Dr. Masha, the G24 has been a proponent of international tax reform. You've brought specific proposals to the table around digital economy. There are lots of discussions underway right now. How do you see us really getting some progress?
Yes, thank you for that question. The UN process, in our own thinking, I mean, one of the reasons why we're supportive of the UN process is that we think that as developing countries, we will have more say in the agenda, and we will be able to influence the process. For the OECD process, it was not so much the case, even though some of the outcomes are some improvement on the status quo. On the UN process, I think that it's still a long way between this stage where the ideas are being synthesized and when it will actually take off. And that's because where we are now is designing the structure. What should be the governance structure? What should be the issues to be addressed, financing and all that. And then you move to the, if it eventually leads to a framework convention, then that's when the issues will be more specifically addressed. In our own contribution, we did recommend, as Professor Ocampo also supports, that the UN Committee on Tax Experts should become a kind of technical secretariat. I think you have a variant of that. Should be a technical secretariat that develops protocols and policies for the convention itself. And then, but there'll still be a political agreement because members obviously represent their countries. And on the protocols, we are recommending things like more focus on illicit financial flows and the issue of tax havens, which we think are not adequately addressed in the OECD framework. All in all, our goal is to have a process where developing countries can get very meaningful revenue that they can then use to address their development and climate goals. This is not the case with the OECD process, and we hope that that is where this UN process will lead to.
Thank you very much. My last question to you, Minister Ndu. Debt is really front and center. It is really a huge challenge for Africa right now. As the Deputy Secretary General said, there are questions about the common framework, whether it needs to be revamped. As a minister and dealing with these issues, what do you think really needs to happen on the debt agenda? I can only give you 1 minute, so I hope you.
Thank you. And indeed, this is an issue that we're dealing with, and it's an issue that when we wake up, we start thinking about debt, and all of a sudden, when we combine climate change and then debt, the whole issue is that more debt is not going to give us a solution. But the whole issue is, for example, on our side in terms of Kenya, we want to make sure that we have a strong fiscal consolidation. That means that we are going to adopt a very strong liability management towards the existing debt. so that we come up with a very strong fiscal position. We adopted or inherited an economy where we have committed in terms of debt. But the bottom line is that given that there are different instruments, what we are going to call for, maybe the international community, is actually to develop instruments that can de-risk some of the de-risking instruments that can help us in terms of that liability management. Then that place, we can talk about scale. Right now, where we are, to deal with the debt situation, we have to actually look for more concessional lending coming from multilateral institutions that can actually then try to get out the commercial debt that is quite problematic. That's the only solution to sustain the current debt position. But going forward, we need to develop instruments, both in terms of tax measures that can actually create a better, should I say, revenue environment. Because right now, for example, we have an IMF program, and the biggest problem right now is that we cannot cope with the revenue targets that we have. But the revenue targets will require that we have to reform the tax system, because the current domestic resource mobilization structure and even tax instruments cannot deliver the revenue. So in a sense, if you cannot deliver the revenue, then you have to go into a fiscal deficit that accumulates future debts. So in a sense, we have to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves, how do we create that sustainable environment? How do we now create an environment where you can create a wider tax base using the instruments available, but also taking advantage of the new elements that are coming up and new markets, for example, climate finance and opportunities that come with it. That's where we are. And I do believe most of the countries are finding themselves there. Look at even those countries that have defaulted. The kind of punishment that they get into is massive. That is why when the last works that we did in this area, we were trying to look at I actually coined growing with the debt in African economies, in the Journal of African Economists in the Oxford, growing with the debt in African economies, because we wanted to show this positiveness. Debt can be sustainable, but we have to have a program. We also have to have de-risking instruments and invest in those so that we have scale of resources to prevent ourselves moving into debt. My ambition right now is to reform the tax system, and that means that we can cope with the revenues in the short run, but in the long run, we have to actually come up with measures that allows us to have a more flexible system that allows fiscal consolidation to take place.
Thank you, Minister. So we have time just for a few questions. Please make them questions. And if you also could direct them, so then the panelists can respond efficiently. So a show of hands, and then I will go around and see. So I'll start here with just so that you just proximate. There's a lady right next to you, right there. Yeah, if you could give her the mic. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, how are you? Thank you for your comments. My question is for Minister Arbeleche and Professor Ocampo. I'm from Colombia, so I'm going to focus in Latin America. How should be the role, or what should be the role of Colombia and Uruguay in the process of the reform? Like, what should be the proposal for our countries? Or maybe let's focus in Latin America, thinking as there is like maybe a consensus, and then the region should act like as a unique voice to have some proposals for those reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lady on that side.
Thank you. Hi, Sue Reed, Climate Finance Advisor, Christiana Figueres at Global Optimism. I'm going to violate the rule in terms of directing question to a particular panelist. It would be terrific to hear from any of the esteemed panelists with regard to the role of private finance and top priority international financial architecture reform, both to deal with the refusal of private creditors to participate in debt treatment, debt relief, and affirmatively looking forward at the landscape of opportunity and IFA reforms to reverse the direction of travel as we're seeing capital outflows from emerging markets and developing countries, and how to really mobilize private capital at scale to bridge the yawning gaps.
Any other questions? Yes, I have one more, and then that's the last one over there. Thank you.
Martin Kessler from the Finance for Development Lab. I have a question on this increase in climate finance that we wish and might happen, but at risk going into repaying existing creditors, since debt service is very high in the next few years. How to avoid that those inflows actually leave out the country and are actually invested in countries in climate action?
Thank you. I thought actually Minister Ndungu answered part of your question, I thought already. Yeah. I'll turn to the panelists. I'll go in this order, starting with Minister Ndungu. And just if you have something that you want to respond to or any final point that you thought you should have mentioned, just a minute each, and then we'll close.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think for me, I would like to say capital flows, it's really a problem in terms of whether it is capital flowing in or capital flowing out. It all depends on domestic policy. And it is attractive for foreign direct investments to go in if they are clear about the, should I say, predictability of the policy space in a particular country. But also when there are risks, then capital flows out. There are cases where capital flows out just because, for example, when interest rates started rising in the US, we came up with a terminology of global dollar shortage. But where was the global dollar shortage? Because actually capital was flowing back to the US because returns were much better. So in a sense, we have to say risk profile is the one that actually drives us. But we have to have a capacity of analyzing that risk and pricing that risk. That is missing. So you find that there is a lot of spurious kind of movements. So in a sense, we have to say, let's be specific in terms of specific areas. You also see capital flows in places where risk is very high, but it is in particular sectors, for example, mining, for example. And that is something we have to make sure that we differentiate between those categories of capital that move. I think I can stop there.
Thank you.
Yes, I think on the issue of private sector participation in the debt resolution exercise, the main one being the common framework. Yes, obviously, the more bilateral, the more participants, the creditors come to the table, then the more the haircuts that the countries will get. But I think this was partly a result of how the whole framework was designed initially, and also the fact that many of the initial countries that went through that process had huge exposure to one single bilateral creditor. But on our own part, we're calling for not just the private sector to come to the table, but also multilateral development banks, because there are many countries that don't even have private creditors, they don't have bilateral creditors, they have only the MDBs, and they're also at serious risk of debt distress. So the best option is for all creditors to come on the table, and then countries can get meaningful haircuts and reductions.
Thank you. Professor Campo?
Okay, about the participation of Colombia and generally, let's say, developing countries in the negotiations, I think basically be active and participate in the processes. For example, Colombia has been very active in the tax issues. It's actually in the committee that is now in the United Nations preparing together with Bolivia and a coalition between the two countries. But also, for example, on climate financing, for example, all the support for the Amazon is also a typical issue, as well as the issue of and perhaps moving to on the climate, although here Minister Azucena is much more knowledgeable and has already said several comments on that. Let me perhaps emphasize that I think one of the big consensuses now is the fact that multilateral development banks should be much more active in the financing of global public goods, including concessional financing and not only for low-income countries, but also for middle-income countries. So I think that's and climate is the particularly important point. And very importantly, the report actually, the Brookings says, the issue of the 50% for adaptation is a basic claim of developing countries that should be clearly in the climate agenda. And last but not least, a topic that is clearly in the chapter 2 of this report, which is the issue of let's say, debt for climate swaps, being used on a large scale, which is actually a very interesting possibility to mix climate financing with the debt issues.
Thank you. Minister Arbelecce.
So I think the question was about debt restructure. Was it that? Yeah. Okay, so Uruguay went through a major debt restructure in 2003. And from there, I think that we set the foundations also for the kind of market-friendly restructure that we think it's convenient, and we were very innovative in that sense. So I think that our recommendation would say, or how we see things when you do have a problem in terms of paying, is to really have a good dialogue with investors, with a multilateral, so that you can reach to a solution. You can negotiate. First of all, you have to explain your particular situation. Is it a liquidity problem? Is it a solvency problem? Where you are? And then ask the investor or the multilateral, in our case it was investors because we were restructuring bonds, what do they need and what they cannot accept. And from there you can come with a solution that is agreed and it's negotiated. So I think it's important to consider that, well, at that time Uruguay came with a collective action clauses on an aggregate base that is something that is embedded in our bonds until today. I think it's important in these cases to consider that the restructurers are not one shot and that's it. You do this, but you continue issuing in the markets or you continue asking for disbursement from multilaterals. So this is something very important to consider in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. If you can all join me on thanking and congratulating this excellent panel. Thank you for coming here on Friday morning. I think we had an excellent keynote, an excellent panel, and the takeaways from this and the work that we are doing on multilateral governance will continue. So please stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.